October 15th, 1941, 23:47 hours. Kharkov, Soviet Ukraine. Nikolai Voznesensky stood on the factory floor of the Kharkov locomotive plant, watching his world being torn apart, deliberately, systematically, piece by piece. The air trembled with the distant percussion of German artillery, each concussion sending ripples through puddles of machine oil that hadn't yet frozen in the October cold. The smell of cutting torches, hot metal, and diesel exhaust hung thick beneath the massive steel rafters of the assembly hall. He was 38 years old, an economist by training, a mathematician by instinct, and as of 3 weeks ago, the man responsible for the most ambitious logistics operation in human history. As deputy chairman of Gosplan, the Soviet State Planning Committee, Voznesensky now controlled the fate of 52 factories, 10 million workers, and quite possibly the survival of the Soviet Union itself. Around him, the organized chaos of industrial dismantlement unfolded in a scene that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Women operated cutting torches, their faces masked behind welding shields, separating massive machine tools from the concrete foundations that had been poured barely 4 years ago. Teenagers, some no older than 15, used sledgehammers and crowbars to dismantle conveyor systems that had, until last week, been producing 25 T-34 tanks every single day. A foreman approached, shouting over the cacophony of metal on metal. "Comrade Voznesensky, the last rail cars are being loaded now. The Germans are 30 kilometers away. Maybe less. We must leave within the hour." Voznesensky consulted his pocket watch, then his clipboard. The numbers told their own story, written in cramped Cyrillic shorthand illuminated by the harsh glare of work lights. Factory number 27. 183, the Kharkov Tank Works, was 87% evacuated. 1,800 railway cars had already departed eastward, carrying the heart of Soviet tank production toward the Urals, 2,000 kilometers away. The massive stamping presses that formed T-34 hulls, the precision lathes that machined gun barrels, the assembly jigs, the die-casting equipment, the blueprints. The skilled workers who knew how to operate it all. What remained now were the things too large to move quickly: the building itself, the power plant, the rail spurs. In 6 hours, German panzers would roll through these gates. They would find empty halls, cold furnaces, and concrete floors scarred where machinery once stood. But they would not find Soviet industrial capacity. That was already moving east. Voznesensky allowed himself a moment, just one, to contemplate the insanity of what he was attempting. Stalin's order had been explicit: evacuate the entire industrial infrastructure of the Western Soviet Union before the Wehrmacht captured it. Not just this factory, not just Kharkov. Everything. The tank plants of Kharkov and Leningrad, the aircraft factories of Moscow, the bearing plants of Gorky, the ammunition works of Tut, the steel mills of Dnipropetrovsk. Move it all. Move it now, and make it work when it gets there. The scope was staggering. It was as if someone had ordered the entire American Rust Belt, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland, to be dismantled, loaded onto trains, and rebuilt in the Rocky Mountains, while the enemy was actively advancing, while artillery shells were falling, while winter approached. The Germans didn't believe it was possible. German intelligence analysts had studied Soviet rail capacity and calculated that evacuating even a fraction of Soviet industry would take years. They assumed Stalin would defend the industrial cities, or, more likely, that the Wehrmacht would capture them intact. But Stalin understood something the Germans didn't. Soviet power rested not in territory, not in cities, not even in the Red Army. It rested in the machines that built the weapons. Lose Moscow, and the war could still be won. Lose the factories, and the war was lost forever. Voznesensky checked his watch again. 23:52 hours, 8 minutes until midnight. The train schedule showed the last convoy departing at 0130 hours, 90 minutes from now. After that, the plant was to be destroyed. Demolition charges were already placed on the remaining infrastructure. Better to leave rubble than give the Germans working facilities. But was 90 minutes enough time? A low rumble, different from the artillery, vibrated through the concrete floor. Another heavy locomotive, straining under a load of machinery, its wheels shrieking as it accelerated eastward into the darkness. Voznesensky did the mathematics in his head, a habit born from years managing Soviet economic plans. If each train carried 500 tons of equipment, and they were running 40 trains per day from this facility alone, Then over 3 weeks they had moved approximately 42,000 tons. The entire plant's movable equipment weighed roughly 45,000 tons, which meant, "We're going to make it," he said aloud, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The foreman looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Comrade, the fascists will arrive too late." Voznesensky's eyes swept across the gutted factory floor. "We're taking it all with us. Every lathe, every press, every blueprint, and in 4 months this factory will be producing tanks again. Not here. Out east, beyond the Germans' reach. And when spring comes, when Hitler thinks he's destroyed Soviet industry, we'll bury him under an avalanche of steel he never saw coming." The foreman stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Around them, the dismantlement continued. Sparks cascaded, metal screamed. Workers shouted coordinates and cursed the weight of machinery that refused to be moved quickly. But it was moving, and that changed everything. Because Voznesensky knew something the Wehrmacht didn't. He knew that wars in the industrial age were not won by warriors alone. They were won by factories, by production capacity, by the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Germany had conquered half of Europe with its blitzkrieg tactics and superior tactics, but tactics couldn't defeat mathematics. And the mathematics Voznesensky was engineering would doom the Third Reich before Hitler ever realized what had happened. The clock struck midnight. 100 days remained until the factories would restart production in their new eastern homes. 100 days to save the Soviet Union. To grasp the magnitude of what Voznesensky was attempting, you must first understand the crisis that made it necessary, and the industrial empire he was trying to save. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft smashed across the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest invasion force in history, and it achieved what even the optimistic German high command considered impossible. Total surprise. Soviet border units were obliterated. Entire armies were encircled within days. By early July, German panzer spearheads had advanced 500 kilometers into Soviet territory. For Stalin and the Soviet leadership, the military disaster was catastrophic, but the industrial threat was existential. The Soviet Union's industrial heartland lay precisely in the path of the German advance. Ukraine produced 60% of Soviet coal and 40% of Soviet steel. Leningrad's factories manufactured sophisticated optical equipment and precision machinery. Moscow's sprawling industrial belt contained 20% of Soviet munitions production. Belarus hosted critical chemical plants and refineries. If Germany captured these regions intact, the Soviet Union would be stripped of the industrial capacity to wage modern war. The Red Army might retreat to the Urals or Siberia, but it would do so without the factories to build tanks, aircraft, or artillery. It would become a pre-industrial army, facing the Wehrmacht's modern mechanized forces. The Germans knew this. Their strategy explicitly aimed to capture, not destroy, Soviet industry. Intelligence reports detailed the locations of key factories. Assault plans emphasized rapid advances to prevent demolitions. Hitler envisioned his Eastern Empire powered by Soviet factories, operated by German managers, feeding the Reich's war machine. But Stalin and the Soviet leadership devised a counter-strategy so audacious it bordered on madness: take the factories themselves and move them beyond German reach. Not just move the workers, move the machines. The precedent was non-existent. No nation in history had attempted to relocate its entire industrial base during wartime. Factories were, by definition, stationary. They required foundations, power plants, rail connections, housing for workers, supply chains for raw materials. You couldn't just pick them up and put them somewhere else. Yet that was exactly what the Soviet Council for Evacuation, headed by Nikolai Voznesensky, Lazar Kaganovich, and Alexei Kosygin, ordered on July 4, 1941, just 12 days after the invasion began. The scale was breathtaking. 1,523 factories were designated for evacuation. Not small workshops, major industrial plants. The Kirov tractor plant in Leningrad employed 13,000 workers. The Kharkov Tank Works had 8,000. The Moscow ball bearing plant was the sole Soviet source of precision bearings for aircraft engines. 10 million people would be moved. Industrial workers, engineers, their families, entire factory communities relocated en masse to prevent the loss of irreplaceable skilled labor. 1.5 million railway cars would be required. The Soviet rail network, already strained by military transport demands, would have to dedicate roughly 30% of its capacity to evacuation. Troops moving to the front would have to share tracks with machinery moving east. 2,000 kilometers was the average evacuation distance. Factories weren't being moved to nearby cities. They were being sent to the Urals, Siberia, regions without existing infrastructure, places where winter temperatures reached -40 degrees Celsius. The logistics were nightmarish. Consider the Kharkov Tank Works, factory number 183, where Voznesensky stood on that October night. The plant contained 4 enormous stamping presses, each weighing 400 tons, 87 precision lathes for machining gun barrels, 23 heat treatment furnaces, 156 kilometers of conveyor systems, 340 electric motors, ranging from 5 horsepower to 500 horsepower, 12,000 metric tons of raw steel stock, 890,000 technical drawings and blueprints. Every single component had to be catalogued, disconnected from foundations, rigged for transport, loaded onto rail cars, and secured for a journey across a war-torn landscape where tracks might be bombed, bridges might be destroyed, and partisan activity might strand convoys in hostile territory. And this was just one factory. The challenges multiplied at every level. Transportation bottlenecks. Soviet railways used a different gauge than European railways, a deliberate defense measure that now complicated logistics. Every locomotive, every car had to be Soviet-made or converted, and the Wehrmacht was advancing faster than trains could evacuate, creating situations where factories raced against panzer columns to reach rail junctions. Destination problems. The eastern regions had no infrastructure to receive evacuated plants. Chelyabinsk, a city of 273,000 in the Urals, would absorb 7 major industrial plants within 4 months. Housing didn't exist. Power generation was inadequate. Rail capacity was marginal. Weather. The autumn rainy season, the Rasputitsa, turned unpaved roads to mud. Winter temperatures would plunge to lethal levels within weeks. Machinery exposed to extreme cold could crack or warp. Workers would be assembling factories in conditions that killed unprotected humans within minutes. Human factors. Workers were being torn from their homes, often with less than 24 hours' notice. Families were split as men went to the front while women and children traveled east with the factories. Food was scarce. Medical care was minimal. The psychological strain was immense. And yet, it was beginning to work. By October 1941, the evacuation was in full swing. Trains departed westward empty and returned east laden with the disassembled components of Soviet industrial might. The Kirov tractor plant's evacuation consumed 6,000 rail cars, the equivalent of 120 full-length freight trains. The Moscow aviation plant number 1 moved in 71 trains. The Zaporozhye steel mill required 8,000 cars. German intelligence officers, sifting through captured documents, struggled to believe what they were reading. Reports described factories evacuating overnight. Aerial reconnaissance showed industrial plants that had been bustling with activity one week and were empty shells the next. But the evacuated equipment wasn't being found by advancing German troops. It had vanished. It was moving east, toward the Urals, toward safety, toward a future where Soviet production would not just resume, it would expand. Because Voznesensky and his team understood the arithmetic of industrial warfare, Germany could produce approximately 2,000 tanks per year at its 1941 capacity. The Soviet Union, before the invasion, produced roughly 2,800 tanks annually. If Germany captured even half of Soviet production capacity, the balance would shift catastrophically. Germany would outproduce the USSR by a factor of 3 or more. But if the Soviets could evacuate their factories, reassemble them beyond German reach, and resume production, the balance would remain competitive. And if, this was the audacious gamble, they could increase production in the new locations by exploiting 2-4-hour shifts, simplified designs, and total economic mobilization, they might even surpass German output. The mathematics were clear. Lose the factories, lose the war. Save the factories, survival became possible. On that October night in Kharkov, as Voznesensky watched the last rail cars being loaded, he was not just evacuating a tank factory. He was engineering the salvation of the Soviet Union, and he had 100 days to make it work. The true battle wasn't fought with tanks or aircraft. It was fought in railway dispatch offices, on frozen factory floors, and in the desperate ingenuity of millions of Soviet citizens racing against time, winter, and a Wehrmacht that didn't believe what it was witnessing. October 16, 1941, 0142 hours. Kharkov Railway Station. The last train pulls away from factory number 183. Voznesensky stands on the platform, watching the red tail lights disappear into darkness. Behind him, demolition charges detonate in sequence. Carefully controlled explosions that collapse roof trusses and buckle foundations, rendering the empty factory useless to the approaching Germans. The ground shakes. Dust billows through the freezing air. But the factory itself, the machines, the tools, the capability, is already 50 kilometers east, accelerating toward the Urals at 45 kilometers per hour. The Volga River crossing. The bottleneck was inevitable. Every factory, every evacuation convoy from the western regions had to cross the Volga. The river was a natural barrier, and the bridges, there were only 12 capable of handling heavy freight, became choke points of biblical proportions. Railway dispatcher Maria Semyonovna Polezheveva managed the Saratov crossing, one of the busiest. Her logbook, preserved in Soviet archives, records the controlled chaos. Train 2471 from Kharkov, 73 cars, machine tools, priority. Urgent. Train 2490 from Moscow, 81 cars, aircraft components, priority. Critical. Train 2502 from Leningrad, 64 cars, optical equipment, priority. Urgent. Queues stretched for 30 kilometers on the western bank. Workers unloaded equipment directly onto riverboats when rail traffic stalled. Some machinery was simply pushed onto barges and floated downstream to alternate crossings. Polozheva worked 9-hour shifts, coordinating with military transport officers who insisted their troop trains had absolute priority, while evacuation officials insisted theirs did. The compromise: alternating schedules. One military train, one evacuation train. All night, every night. The mathematics were brutal. 40 trains per day needed to cross. Each crossing took 35 minutes. That gave theoretical capacity for 41 trains per day, if nothing went wrong. But things went wrong constantly. Locomotives broke down, cars derailed, air raids forced traffic into tunnels, yet somehow the trains kept moving. November 7th. Chelyabinsk, Urals. The first evacuated factories arrive at their destinations. Chelyabinsk, a provincial city of 273,000, was about to become the Tankograd, Tank City. 7 major industrial plants were being relocated here: the Kharkov Tank Plant from Leningrad, the Kharkov Diesel Factory, the Moscow Dynamo Works, and others. The challenge: Chelyabinsk lacked everything. No factory buildings, no worker housing, no power generation capacity sufficient for heavy industry. Temperatures already hovered at -15 degrees Celsius and would drop to -40 degrees Celsius within weeks. Chief Engineer Isaac Saltzman, responsible for reassembling the Kharkov plant, walked the designated site, a snow-covered field on the city's outskirts. No foundations, no walls, not even surveyor stakes. His orders were unambiguous: begin production within 90 days. The solution was improvisation on a scale that defied belief. Workers erected temporary structures using whatever materials were available: wooden frames, sheet metal, scavenged from dismantled rail cars, canvas tarps. One assembly building was constructed with walls made from stacked crates that still contained machinery. The crates themselves became the building's structure. Machinery was installed outdoors when buildings couldn't be completed in time. Lathes operated in the open air, shielded from snow by tarpaulins. Workers wore every piece of clothing they owned, layer upon layer, and still suffered frostbite when temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Power was a nightmare. The existing electrical grid couldn't support industrial demand. Engineers jury-rigged portable generators, running diesel engines 24 hours a day. When fuel ran short, some factories burned wood to power steam generators, an approach that would have been laughable in peacetime, but was now essential. Housing was non-existent. Workers initially lived in the factory buildings themselves, sleeping beside the machines they operated. Beds were planks laid across sawhorses. Heat came from makeshift stoves fashioned from oil drums. Sanitation was improvised. A German intelligence officer, reading captured Soviet documents months later, wrote in his report, "Either these accounts represent deliberate disinformation, or the Soviets have achieved impossible industrial feats through methods that violate every principle of modern manufacturing." It was the latter. November 15th. Moscow Ball Bearing Plant Number 5. 1. Not every evacuation succeeded. Plant Number 1 in Moscow was the Soviet Union's primary source of precision ball bearings, components essential for aircraft engines, tank transmissions, and artillery mechanisms. Without bearings, machines seized and failed. The plant's evacuation began on October 16th, the day of the panic in Moscow when rumors spread that German tanks were approaching the city. Chaos erupted. Workers fled. Some machinery was loaded hastily onto trucks that were never seen again. Critical blueprints were lost in the confusion. The plant's director, Konstantin Matveyevich Kharkov, managed to evacuate approximately 60% of the facility to Saratov. But the remaining 40%, including the specialized hardening furnaces and precision grinding equipment, was captured by the Germans when they pushed closer to Moscow in December. For Soviet production planners, this was catastrophic. Ball bearing production plummeted. Aircraft engine production stalled. Tank transmissions failed at higher rates due to lower quality bearings. The solution? Lend-Lease. American-made ball bearings arriving via Arctic convoy. By mid-1942, over 60% of Soviet aircraft used American bearings. It was a brutal lesson. Even partial evacuation failure could cascade through the entire industrial system. December 8th, Factory Number 183, Nizhny Tagil. 123 days after evacuation began, the Kharkov Tank Works, now reassembled in the Ural Mountains city of Nizhny Tagil, produces its first T-34 tank. The tank is crude by pre-war standards. Surface finish is rough. Some components are simplified versions of the original designs. But it runs. It shoots. It's combat-ready. Chief Engineer Konstantin Yeremievich Rupsov stands beside the tank, watching welders make final adjustments. His hands are bandaged, second-degree frostbite from working outdoors in -38 degrees Celsius weather. Half his workers are hospitalized with pneumonia, exhaustion, or cold-related injuries. But the tank is built, and tomorrow, 2 more will roll off the line. Then 3, then 5. By January, they'll hit 10 tanks per day. By March, the Germans believe Soviet tank production has collapsed. Intelligence estimates project a 70% reduction in output due to captured factories. They are catastrophically wrong. The mathematics of industrial resurrection. Here's what actually happened. October 1941, Soviet tank production equals 462 tanks. November 1941, Soviet tank production equals 734 tanks. Soviet tank production equals 491 tanks. Dip during factory relocations. January 1942, Soviet tank production equals 543 tanks. February 1942, Soviet tank production equals 1618 tanks. June 1942, Soviet tank production equals 2,200 tanks per month. By mid-1942, Soviet tank production exceeded pre-war rates. Despite having evacuated the factories, despite losing territory containing 40% of the population, despite operating in unheated buildings in Siberian conditions. How? 2 4-hour shifts. Factories ran continuously. Workers operated on 1 2-hour shifts 7 days per week. Sleep happened at the factory. Food was delivered to workstations. The human cost was immense. Malnutrition, exhaustion, industrial accidents, but production soared. Design simplification. Engineers eliminated non-essential features. The T-34's transmission was simplified from 5-speed to 4-speed. Internal finish work was reduced. Parts that could be welded were welded instead of being machined. Manufacturing time per tank dropped from 8,000 man-hours to 3,700 man-hours. Labor mobilization. Women replaced men sent to the front. Teenagers as young as 14 operated machinery. Gulag prisoners were relocated to factory cities and put to work under guard. The Soviet workforce expanded even as the accessible population shrank. Specialized production. Factories focused on single products. No more diversification. Plant number 183 built only T-34s. Plant number 174 built only KV-1 heavy tanks. Specialization increased efficiency dramatically. Lend-Lease supplements. American supplied trucks, aluminum, machine tools, and raw materials freed Soviet production to focus on weapons. The Studebaker US-6 trucks we covered in another video were arriving by the thousands, allowing Soviet factories to build tanks instead of transport vehicles. By spring 1942, the impossible had become reality. Soviet industrial production in the Urals, Siberia, and Kazakhstan exceeded the production levels of the captured western regions before the invasion. The evacuation had worked. December 25, 1941. German High Command, East Prussia. General Franz Halder, Chief of the German General Staff, reviewed the latest intelligence summaries on Soviet industrial capacity. The numbers didn't make sense. German forces had captured Kharkov, Leningrad was besieged, Moscow was under threat, the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union was in German hands or cut off. By every rational calculation, Soviet production should be collapsing. Instead, Soviet tank numbers were increasing. Red Army units destroyed in September were reappearing in December with full equipment. New tank brigades were forming faster than German intelligence could track them. Where were the tanks coming from? Halder's intelligence officers provided the answer. The evacuated factories were operational. Halder's handwritten note in the margin of the report, preserved in archives. If this assessment is accurate, the campaign is lost. We are destroying Soviet armies, but we are not destroying Soviet production capacity. The strategic objective has failed. He was right. The Soviet factory evacuation of 1941 was not merely a logistical achievement. It was the moment when industrial mathematics overpowered military tactics as the decisive factor in modern warfare. Let's examine the numbers that tell the real story. Germany's industrial calculation. When Operation Barbarossa began, German planners made a seemingly reasonable assumption. Capturing Soviet industrial regions would cripple Soviet war production. The captured territories contained 63% of Soviet coal production, 68% of Soviet pig iron production, 58% of Soviet steel production, 60% of Soviet aluminum production, 41% of Soviet railway track. By any conventional analysis, losing these assets should have been fatal. If the Soviet Union were a corporation, seizing 60% of its production facilities would force bankruptcy. But the Soviet Union wasn't playing by corporate rules. The mathematics of dispersal. Here's what the Germans didn't anticipate. The evacuated factories didn't just resume production, they exceeded it. Pre-war Soviet industrial output, 1940. Tanks, 2,794 units aircraft, 10,565 units artillery pieces, 15,300 units Soviet industrial output after evacuation, 1942. Tanks, 24,446 units, 8.7x increase. Aircraft, 25,436 units, 2.410x increase. Artillery pieces, 33,111 units, 2.2x increase. This wasn't just recovery, this was industrial expansion during territorial collapse. How did production increase while losing 60% of the pre-war industrial base? The answer lies in total economic mobilization and industrial efficiency that Germany, for all its vaunted organization, never achieved. Labor mobilization differential, Soviet Union, 1942, 15.5 million, up from 11 million in 1940. Women in industrial workforce, 52%, up from 29%. Average work week 72 hours, 12 hours/day, 6 days/week vacation days. Zero labor efficiency declined 28% per worker, but total output soared due to volume. Germany, 1942, industrial workforce, 12. 1 million women in industrial workforce, 29% average work week, 55 hours vacation days, maintained civilian holiday schedules until 1943. Labor efficiency, higher per worker, but constrained by peacetime labor practices, the differential is stark. Soviet workers worked 30% longer hours, included far more women, and operated under total war mobilization. German production retained peacetime constraints until 1943, 2 years into the war. Production system philosophy. Germany optimized for quality. Soviet Union optimized for quantity. Example: German Tiger tank versus Soviet T-34 tank Tiger. High production manufacturing time. 300,000 man-hours per tank. Production rate. Peak of 104 tanks per month. August 1944. Total produced 1,347 tanks. Entire war. Quality, superior armor, superior gun, superior optics, strategic impact. Insufficient numbers to affect outcome. T-34. Production, manufacturing time. 3,700 man-hours per tank. By 1942. Production rate. Peak of 200 plus tanks per month. 1943. Total produced 84,070 tanks. Entire war, all variants. Quality. Adequate armor, adequate gun, adequate optics, strategic impact, overwhelming numerical advantage, the ratio. Germany produced one Tiger for every 62 T-34s produced by the Soviet Union. This wasn't inefficiency. It was strategic choice. Soviet engineers deliberately designed for mass production. The T-34's sloped armor was simpler to manufacture than the Tiger's complex interlocking plates. The T-34's Christie suspension was cruder but faster to assemble than the Tiger's torsion bar system. The replacement mathematics. Here's where industrial capacity became destiny. Battle of Kursk, July 1943. German tank losses. Approximately 760 tanks destroyed. Soviet tank losses. Approximately 1,614 tanks destroyed. Germany lost fewer tanks. But then comes the industrial mathematics. German replacement rate. 2,000 tanks produced per year equals 166 tanks per month. Soviet replacement rate. 24,000 tanks produced per year, 2,000 tanks per month. Germany's Kursk losses. 760 tanks required. 4.6 months to replace. Soviet Kursk losses, 1,614 tanks, required 0.8 months, 24 days, to replace. Within 1 month, the Soviet tank force was fully reconstituted. Within 5 months, the German tank force was still recovering from Kursk losses. This is how you lose a war while winning battles. The evacuation strategic dividend. The 1941 evacuation didn't just save Soviet industry, it transformed it. The old industrial model, factories in vulnerable Western cities, near borders, optimized for peacetime production. The new industrial model, factories deep in the interior, beyond bomber range, optimized for wartime mass production, immune to German ground attack. By relocating industry to the Urals and Siberia, the Soviets created fortress factories, industrial citadels that could produce war material without fear of German disruption. The Tankograd complex in Chelyabinsk alone produced more tanks in 1943 than the entire German tank industry. Moreover, the dispersal created redundancy. Before the evacuation, the destruction of a single ball-bearing plant in Moscow could cripple aircraft production. After the evacuation, production was distributed across a dozen facilities. Losing one reduced output by 8%, not 100%. The German blunder. German strategy assumed capturing Soviet territory would capture Soviet production. But industrial capacity equals industrial territory. Germany captured the territory. The Soviet Union evacuated the capacity. It's as if the Germans conquered Detroit and found empty factory buildings, while Ford had moved the assembly lines, machine tools, and workers to Colorado and resumed production there within 3 months. German economic planners never conceived this was possible. Their entire strategic framework rested on the assumption that factories were immobile. You attacked them where they stood. You captured them or destroyed them. The Soviet evacuation invalidated this assumption entirely. The human cost. The numbers that made victory possible were built on suffering that defies easy description. Of the 10 million people evacuated with the factories, estimated 1520% died during the first winter, 1944-2, from cold, disease, malnutrition. Average caloric intake in factory cities, 1,2,0,0,1. 400 calories per day, 19 starvation, 1,200. Average lifespan reduction for factory workers, estimated 8.12 years due to wartime conditions, orphans created by evacuation stress, conservatively 500,000 plus workers operated lathes with frostbitten hands. Children assembled artillery shells while suffering from rickets due to malnutrition. Pregnant women welded tank hulls until labor pains forced them to stop, gave birth and returned to work within days. The productivity wasn't achieved through efficiency. It was achieved through sacrifice that would be considered criminal in any peacetime context. But the alternative was Nazi occupation, which meant systematic extermination, as Soviet citizens would discover in occupied territories. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Work to exhaustion and survive, or refuse and perish. The ultimate calculation. Germany entered Operation Barbarossa with a production advantage, superior factories, superior efficiency, access to conquered European industry. By 1943, the Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in every category of ground warfare equipment, Tanks, Soviet Union 24,000 year versus Germany 12,000 year 2-1 advantage. Artillery Soviet Union 33,000 Germany 23,000 year 1.41 advantage. Or 1 advantage, small arms, Soviet Union 6.1 million/year versus Germany 3.2 million/year 1.91 advantage. The inversion was complete. The country that had lost 40% of its population and 60% of its pre-war industrial base was now outproducing the intact aggressor by nearly 2-1. This wasn't a miracle, it was mathematics. The evacuation of 1523 factories in 100 days had transformed the strategic balance of the war, and Nikolai Voznesensky, the economist who orchestrated it, had proven a truth that military historians still struggle to accept. In industrial warfare, the assembly line is more powerful than the front line. Nikolai Voznesensky survived the war, but barely survived the peace. As deputy chairman of Gosplan and later chairman of the State Planning Commission, he was one of the Soviet Union's most powerful economic administrators throughout the war. His meticulous planning and ruthless efficiency had saved Soviet industry. Stalin awarded him the Order of Lenin 3 times, but in Stalin's paranoid post-war purges, competence became suspicious. In 1949, Voznesensky was arrested on fabricated charges of anti-Soviet conspiracy. On October 1, 1950, he was executed by firing squad at age 47. His crime? Being too capable, too independent, too threatening to Stalin's absolute control. His legacy, however, could not be erased. The evacuated factories never returned to their original locations. Tankograd in Chelyabinsk continued producing tanks through the Cold War. The Urals, once a backwater region, became the Soviet Union's industrial heartland, a fortress of production that sustained Soviet military power for the next 50 years. The final numbers: the evacuation of 1941 moved 1,523 industrial plants, 10 million people, 2.5 million tons of equipment, over a period of 150 days across an average distance of 2,000 kilometers. By 1942, production exceeded pre-war levels. 24,446 tanks produced versus 2,094 in 1940, 25,436 aircraft produced versus 10,565 in 1940, 356,400 machine guns produced, 40. The human cost? Estimated 1.5. 2 million deaths during evacuation and first winter. 100,000+ workers died from industrial accidents during wartime production. Average lifespan of evacuated workers reduced by 8.12 years. The strategic impact. Germany never recovered industrial parity after 1942. Soviet numerical advantage in equipment increased throughout 1994-130. The evacuation made Allied victory on the Eastern Front mathematically inevitable. The broader lesson: the story of the Soviet factory evacuation is rarely taught in Western schools because it contradicts comfortable narratives about how wars are won. We prefer stories of heroic battles, Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin, stories where warriors decide outcomes through courage and sacrifice. But the Soviet victory was decided in October 1941, on railway platforms, in freezing factory buildings, by exhausted workers operating lathes they just reassembled after a 2,000-kilometer journey. It was decided by Nikolai Voznesensky, an economist with a clipboard calculating train schedules and production quotas, while German panzers advanced towards his cities. The evacuation proved several uncomfortable truths about modern industrial warfare. Truth number 1. Factories are more important than territory. Germany conquered 40% of Soviet territory and still lost because the production capacity escaped. Truth number 2. Industrial mobility defeats military mobility. The Wehrmacht's Blitzkrieg was the fastest military advance in history, but Soviet trains moving factories eastward achieved strategic mobility that panzer columns couldn't match. Truth number 3. System resilience beats tactical excellence. German forces won nearly every battle in 1941-42. But the Soviet industrial system absorbed losses and replaced them faster than Germany could inflict them. Truth number 4. Total mobilization defeats limited mobilization. The Soviet willingness to sacrifice everything, comfort, safety, peacetime labor standards, even lives, generated production volumes Germany couldn't match while maintaining civilian quality of life. Truth number 5. Long-term sustainability beats short-term superiority. German tanks were better. German tactics were better. But Soviet industrial sustainability meant good enough equipment in overwhelming numbers defeated excellent equipment in limited numbers. The echo across time. The Soviet factory evacuation remains the largest forced industrial relocation in human history. Nothing before or since has matched its scale, but its lessons echo in modern strategic thinking. Supply chain resilience matters more than efficiency. Industrial dispersal protects against disruption. Production capacity determines long-term strategic outcomes. Logistics infrastructure is a military asset, not just an economic one. Today, they are foundational to military and economic planning. Voznesensky's achievement, moving 1523 factories in 100 days, saved the Soviet Union. But more than that, it transformed our understanding of how industrial nations wage war. The Wehrmacht marched into the Soviet Union expecting to fight the Red Army. Instead, they fought the Soviet industrial system, and the industrial system won. Closing reflection. Today, if you visit Nizhny Tagil or Chelyabinsk or Omsk, the cities that received evacuated factories in 1941, you'll find industrial plants still operating in buildings that were erected in desperate haste 80 years ago. Some still have the makeshift wooden additions. Some retain the railway sidings built to unload machinery from evacuation trains. The workers who built tanks in unheated warehouses at -40 degrees Celsius are gone now, but the factories remain. They are monuments to an industrial achievement that saved a nation and changed the course of history, not through military genius, but through economic mathematics and human endurance pushed beyond sustainable limits. Nikolai Voznesensky understood what many military commanders never grasp. Modern wars are won by those who can sustain production, not those who win the first battles. He proved that in modern warfare, the assembly line is more powerful, and in doing so, he doomed Nazi Germany before Hitler ever realized what had happened. If you found this deep dive into industrial warfare compelling, consider subscribing. We explore the hidden mathematics of history, the stories where spreadsheets defeated soldiers, where factories won battles, where logistics changed the world. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what other forgotten stories of industrial warfare should we cover next? Have you heard of Tankograd before? Did you know the Soviet Union evacuated its entire industrial base? This war wasn't won by warriors alone. It was won by workers, engineers, and economists who understood that industrial mathematics determines military outcomes. The assembly line defeated the front line, and that story deserves to be told.